She's been using hotel rooms to figure herself out, she said when I found the receipts. I found them by accident, digging through Vanessa's purse for her car keys while she was in the shower. I'm not the type to snoop, never have been, but there they were scattered at the bottom of her bag like discarded secrets waiting to destroy my world. Hotel receipts from the Phoenician Resort, the Ritz-Carlton, the Four Seasons Scottsdale, places that cost more per night than most people make in a week. 3 months worth of them, each one a small paper knife twisting in my gut as I realized what I was looking at. Vanessa taught elementary school and made maybe $45,000 a year, while I worked as an engineering consultant pulling in decent money, enough for our comfortable Phoenix apartment and the engagement ring I'd been secretly saving for in my sock drawer. But these receipts were for places neither of us could afford on our combined salaries, and definitely not something she could swing on a teacher's budget without some serious financial backing from elsewhere. The first receipt was dated 3 months ago, the Grand Canyon Suite at the Phoenician for 2 nights at $600 per night. Room service charges for 2 dinners, 2 bottles of Dom Perignon at $300 each, spa treatments booked under the name V. Chen instead of her real last name of Rodriguez. My hands shook as I photographed each receipt with my phone, the evidence mounting with every image that painted a picture I didn't want to see. The Ritz-Carlton Downtown Presidential Suite, the Four Seasons Scottsdale penthouse level, always the same pattern of room service for 2 people and spa bookings under different names that suggested she was hiding something significant from someone, probably me. Each receipt showed a level of luxury that was completely disconnected from our actual financial reality, the kind of spending that spoke to either massive credit card debt or someone else's wallet funding these romantic getaways. When she emerged from the bathroom wrapped in my favorite towel, hair still damp and smelling like the expensive shampoo I'd bought her for her birthday, I was sitting on our bed with the receipts spread out like a losing poker hand that was about to cost me everything. She saw them immediately, her face cycling through surprise, guilt, panic, then settling on defiance like she was the victim here and I was some kind of monster for discovering her secret. I asked her about them calmly, keeping my voice level even though my heart was hammering against my ribs and my mouth had gone completely dry. She sat down across from me on the bed we'd shared for 2 years and delivered her explanation with the kind of confidence that made me question my own sanity for a moment. She needed space to think about our relationship, she said, space to figure out what she wanted from life without my influence clouding her judgment or pressuring her into decisions she wasn't ready to make. The hotel rooms were her sanctuary, her place to soul search and meditate on our future together without the distractions of daily life and routine. She made it sound almost spiritual, like she was some kind of relationship monk seeking enlightenment in overpriced hotel suites with thread counts higher than my credit score. But the room service orders told a completely different story, 2 entrees every time, wine pairings that suggested romantic dinners, late-night dessert deliveries and champagne that suggested anything but solitary contemplation about our relationship. When I pointed this out, when I mentioned the spa treatments under fake names and the fact that these hotels cost more than her monthly take-home salary, her whole demeanor shifted from mystical guru to militant defender of her personal freedom. I was invading her privacy, she said, violating her trust by going through her personal belongings without permission like some kind of controlling stalker boyfriend. How dare I question her need for personal space and growth as an individual when all she was trying to do was become a better person for our relationship? She stood up and paced our bedroom like a caged animal, gesticulating wildly as she explained why my concerns were actually character flaws on my part that revealed my fundamental inability to trust and support her personal development. I was being controlling, possessive, unable to understand that healthy relationships required individual exploration and boundary setting that didn't include constant surveillance and interrogation. The fact that I couldn't support her journey of self-discovery without turning it into some kind of Spanish Inquisition proved that maybe she was right to question our compatibility and whether I was mature enough for the kind of committed relationship she envisioned. I watched this performance with growing clarity, seeing how expertly she was deflecting every legitimate question I'd raised and turning my reasonable concerns into personal attacks on her character and autonomy. 3 years together and I was learning that the woman I'd planned to marry, the woman whose ring size I'd memorized and whose favorite flowers I'd researched for the proposal, was either a master manipulator or completely delusional about her own behavior. Either option made my stomach turn and my future plans crumble, but I kept my expression neutral as she continued her tirade about privacy and personal growth and my apparent inability to understand either concept. The receipts were still scattered between us on the bed, physical evidence that contradicted every word coming out of her mouth, but she spoke with such conviction and righteous indignation that for a moment I almost doubted what my own eyes were telling me. That's when I realized I'd been living with a stranger who was capable of looking me in the face and lying with the skill of a professional politician. I started digging deeper the next morning after Vanessa left for work, her kiss on my cheek feeling like a betrayal now that I knew what those lips had been doing in luxury hotel suites with someone else. I pulled up our shared credit card statements on my laptop, something I'd never felt the need to scrutinize before because I trusted her completely, and what I found made my coffee turn cold in my cup. The charges were all there, hidden in plain sight among our normal expenses like landmines waiting to explode my entire worldview. Expensive dinners at restaurants I'd never heard of, wine purchases that cost more than our monthly grocery budget, entertainment charges for events and shows that she'd never mentioned attending with me. The pattern was clear once I started looking for it, always the same timing as those hotel receipts, always charged to our joint account that I'd foolishly given her access to because we were building a life together. At least that's what I'd thought we were doing while she was apparently building something entirely different with someone else using my money to fund it. The most damaging evidence came from her social media accounts, which she'd kept surprisingly public for someone supposedly seeking private soul-searching time in expensive hotels. I spent my lunch break scrolling through her Instagram posts from the past 3 months, looking for clues I'd missed while being the trusting boyfriend who didn't monitor his girlfriend's online activity. That's when I found the photos that made everything crystal clear, images of Vanessa at upscale restaurants and exclusive events around Phoenix, always beautifully dressed in outfits I didn't recognize and definitely hadn't paid for. But she wasn't alone in these carefully cropped photos. There were glimpses of a man's hand reaching for wine glasses, shadows of someone sitting across from her at intimate dinner tables, reflections in mirrors and windows that showed a tall figure with expensive taste in watches and clothing. The man's name was Brian, as I discovered when I started following the social media breadcrumbs like a digital detective investigating my own relationship. Brian Morrison, according to his LinkedIn profile, a real estate investor who specialized in luxury properties and apparently had the income to match his expensive lifestyle preferences. His Instagram was a showcase of wealth and success, photos from exclusive golf courses, expensive cars, and yes, the same upscale restaurants where Vanessa had been posting her mysterious dinner photos. Brian tagged locations constantly, always high-end places around Phoenix, and when I cross-referenced his posts with Vanessa's, the overlap was too obvious to ignore or explain away as coincidence. Our mutual friends provided the final pieces of the puzzle when I started asking casual questions about Vanessa's recent activities and social circles. Sarah from her teaching team mentioned that Vanessa had been talking about a photography side business she was developing with the help of a mentor who understood the real estate marketing world. Jessica from our college friend group said Vanessa had introduced her to a business mentor named Brian at a networking event, describing him as someone who was helping her explore entrepreneurial opportunities outside of teaching. Even my neighbor Tom had seen Vanessa getting into an expensive BMW that definitely wasn't her beat-up Honda Civic, though he'd assumed she was just getting a ride from someone and hadn't thought much about it until I started piecing together the timeline. When I tried to discuss our financial situation that evening, bringing up the unexplained charges I'd discovered on our joint credit card, Vanessa immediately went on the offensive like she'd been preparing for this conversation. I was being paranoid and controlling, she said, questioning her every move like some kind of financial dictator who couldn't handle his girlfriend having independent interests and ambitions. These charges were investments in her future, networking expenses and professional development costs that any supportive partner would understand and encourage rather than interrogate. She turned my legitimate concerns about unauthorized spending into character assassinations about my inability to trust her or support her entrepreneurial dreams. The photography business she was developing required her to attend industry events and meet with potential clients, she explained with the patience of someone talking to a child who didn't understand adult responsibilities. Brian was simply a mentor who understood the real estate marketing world and was generous enough to share his knowledge with someone just starting out in the field. The fact that I couldn't see the long-term potential of her business venture and instead focused on short-term expenses showed that maybe I didn't understand her goals and ambitions as well as she'd hoped. I sat there listening to her weave this elaborate narrative about professional development and business mentoring, watching her face as she delivered each carefully constructed explanation with conviction that almost made me question my own observations. But then I remembered the hotel receipts, the intimate dinner photos, the matching timelines and locations that painted a very different picture than the one she was trying to sell me. That night I checked our shared savings account, the one we'd opened specifically for the engagement ring I'd been planning to buy, and discovered that over $8,000 had been withdrawn in small amounts over the past 3 months. Money that was supposed to represent our future together had been funding her present with someone else, and the realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I'd been working overtime and skipping lunches to contribute to an engagement fund that was actually financing my girlfriend's affair with a real estate investor who could afford to take her places I'd been saving months to experience with her. The betrayal wasn't just emotional anymore, it was financial, practical, and absolutely devastating in ways I was still trying to process. The decision to plan my exit came to me with the kind of clarity that only arrives after you've been living in fog for months without realizing it. I wasn't going to confront Vanessa again, wasn't going to give her another opportunity to gaslight me or spin elaborate stories about professional development and business mentoring. Instead, I was going to document everything, gather irrefutable evidence, and execute the kind of strategic withdrawal that would leave her scrambling to explain her situation to everyone who mattered. I started taking screenshots of every social media post, every credit card charge, every piece of evidence that painted the real picture of what had been happening while I'd been planning our future together like some kind of naive romantic fool. The photos went into a cloud storage folder that she couldn't access, organized by date and location with meticulous attention to detail that would have made my engineering professors proud. I printed out bank statements, credit card bills, hotel receipts, and created a comprehensive timeline that showed exactly when our relationship had become a convenient cover story for her actual life with Brian. My cousin Tyler worked in property management and had connections throughout the Phoenix rental market, so I called him under the pretense of helping a coworker find an apartment, carefully gathering information about available units without revealing my real situation. Tyler knew several landlords who could move quickly on applications and didn't require lengthy approval processes, which was exactly what I needed for a clean, fast exit that wouldn't give Vanessa time to interfere or create drama. I started viewing apartments during my lunch breaks, telling my boss I had medical appointments that required confidentiality, and found a decent one-bedroom place in Tempe that was available for immediate occupancy. The security deposit and first month's rent would drain my emergency fund, but it was worth it to escape cleanly without having to negotiate or explain myself to someone who'd been lying to my face for months. While I was planning my physical exit, I made another discovery that changed everything about how I viewed Brian and Vanessa's relationship dynamic. A reverse image search on one of Brian's Instagram photos led me to his wife's social media accounts, which told a completely different story than the single, successful businessman narrative that Vanessa had apparently been sold. Brian Morrison was married to Catherine Morrison, a pediatric nurse with 2 young children, and their family Instagram account was full of recent vacation photos from the exact dates when Brian was supposedly mentoring Vanessa through her business development journey. The irony was almost laughable if it wasn't so devastating to multiple families. While I'd been discovering hotel receipts and restaurant charges, Catherine Morrison had been posting happy family photos from their trip to San Diego with their 6-year-old daughter and 4-year-old son. Brian had been leading a double life that made Vanessa's deception look amateur by comparison, and she was apparently too infatuated or naive to realize she was the other woman in someone else's marriage rather than the sophisticated businesswoman she'd convinced herself she was becoming. I downloaded every family photo Catherine had posted, every image that proved Brian was a married father rather than the available mentor Vanessa thought she was dating, because I knew this information would be crucial when everything inevitably imploded. Vanessa announced on Wednesday that she needed another weekend at the hotel to continue her soul-searching journey, explaining that she'd made a breakthrough in understanding herself and needed uninterrupted time to process her emotions about our relationship. She'd be staying at the Ritz-Carlton again, she said, because the environment there helped her think clearly about what she wanted from life and love. The way she delivered this information with such sincerity almost made me admire her commitment to the performance, even though I now knew she was planning another romantic getaway with a married man using money stolen from our engagement fund. I told her that sounded like a great idea, that I supported her journey of self-discovery completely and hoped she found the clarity she was seeking. The genuine relief on her face when I didn't question or resist her plans was almost heartbreaking, because it showed how exhausting it must have been to maintain her elaborate deception while living with someone who actually loved her. Friday afternoon, after Vanessa left for her fake soul-searching weekend with her married real estate mentor, I put my exit plan into motion with military precision. I'd already moved most of my valuable belongings to a storage unit over the previous 2 weeks, claiming I was decluttering to create better feng shui in our living space, and Vanessa had been so distracted by her double life that she hadn't noticed entire boxes of my possessions disappearing from our apartment. Tyler arrived with his pickup truck at exactly 6 p.m., and we loaded the remaining furniture and personal items that actually belonged to me, leaving behind only the things Vanessa had bought or that we'd purchased together using money from our joint account. I left a detailed financial breakdown on our kitchen table, meticulously calculating exactly how much money she'd taken from our shared accounts for her hotel adventures and restaurant experiences with Brian, along with copies of all the evidence I'd gathered over the past 2 weeks. The document was titled, Financial Summary of Relationship Dissolution, and included bank statements, credit card records, hotel receipts, and printed screenshots of social media posts that told the real story of how our engagement fund had been redirected to finance someone else's marriage counseling retreat. I also left the spare apartment key, a copy of the lease transfer paperwork I'd prepared, and a brief note explaining that I'd helped her figure herself out by removing the financial safety net that had been enabling her exploration of other relationships. The lease was in both our names, but I'd spoken with our landlord about transferring my portion to her exclusively, leaving her responsible for the full rent payment that she'd have to manage on a teacher's salary without access to my engineering consultant income. It was going to be a mathematical impossibility, but that was her problem to solve now that she'd chosen her path so definitively. The execution of my exit plan unfolded like a precisely choreographed engineering project, each step calculated to maximize impact while minimizing my exposure to drama and manipulation. By Saturday evening, my entire life had been systematically removed from the apartment Vanessa and I had shared for 2 years, leaving behind only the evidence of her deception and the financial reality she'd have to face alone. I'd spent Friday night in my new Tempe apartment, sitting on the floor eating takeout Chinese food and feeling a strange mixture of liberation and grief as I processed the end of what I'd thought was the most important relationship of my adult life. Tyler had helped me change my phone number and update my address with the bank, my employer, and anyone else who needed to reach me, creating a clean break that would prevent Vanessa from tracking me down through official channels or mutual contacts. I'd also removed my name from our joint credit cards, utilities, and the lease transfer paperwork that would make her solely responsible for an apartment she couldn't afford on her elementary school teacher salary. The beauty of my plan was that Vanessa would discover everything on Monday morning when she returned from her romantic weekend with Brian, giving her exactly 0 time to prepare or manipulate the situation to her advantage. I'd arranged for Tyler to deliver the apartment keys and lease documents to Desert Bloom Elementary School during her lunch break, ensuring that she'd receive them in a public setting where she couldn't create a scene or break down emotionally without professional consequences. The timing was perfect because she'd be trapped at work, surrounded by colleagues and students, forced to maintain her composure while processing the reality that her financial safety net had disappeared overnight. I'd also drafted a brief letter to her principal explaining that due to personal circumstances, I would no longer be available as an emergency contact for Vanessa Rodriguez and that any future communications should be directed through her family members rather than me. The letter was professional and vague enough to avoid creating workplace drama while ensuring that my name would be completely removed from her professional life as well as her personal one. Monday afternoon, my phone started buzzing with calls from unknown numbers, which I let go to voicemail since I'd anticipated Vanessa would try to reach me through borrowed phones or friends' devices once she realized I'd blocked her completely. The voicemail started desperate and quickly escalated to panicked as she apparently began to grasp the scope of what had happened while she was away playing house with her married mentor. She'd returned to an empty apartment, she said in one message, with only her belongings remaining and a stack of financial documents that made it clear I knew everything about her extracurricular activities. She needed to talk to me immediately, needed to explain everything, needed me to understand that whatever I thought was happening was completely wrong and based on misunderstandings that she could clear up if I'd just give her 5 minutes to explain her side of the story. The progression of her messages told the story of someone slowly realizing that their carefully constructed house of lies was collapsing and taking their financial security with it. By Tuesday, the messages had shifted from desperate explanations to angry accusations about my cruelty and cowardice, leaving her to deal with an impossible situation without warning or discussion like some kind of vindictive monster who'd abandoned someone he claimed to love. She'd called Tyler, she said, and he'd refused to tell her where I was living or how to reach me, which proved that I was orchestrating this entire situation like a calculated revenge plot rather than a mature response to relationship problems that could have been worked through with honest communication. Wednesday brought the financial panic as Vanessa apparently began calculating the mathematics of her new reality without my engineering salary to cover the expenses she'd become accustomed to charging to our joint accounts. The rent alone was more than half her monthly take-home pay, before adding utilities, groceries, and the credit card bills she'd accumulated during her luxury lifestyle exploration with Brian. She'd already contacted the landlord, she said in increasingly frantic voicemails, but he'd explained that I'd followed proper legal procedures for removing myself from the lease and that she was now solely responsible for maintaining the rental agreement or facing eviction proceedings. Her attempts to reach me through mutual friends backfired spectacularly when I'd already informed everyone important about the situation, providing them with carefully selected evidence that made it impossible for Vanessa to control the narrative or portray herself as the abandoned victim of my sudden personality change. Sarah from her teaching team called me directly after Vanessa tried to enlist her support, saying she'd seen the hotel receipts and credit card statements I'd shared and couldn't believe how long this had been going on without anyone noticing the obvious signs. Jessica from our college friend group was less diplomatic, telling me she'd always suspected Vanessa was materialistic and selfish but had never realized she was capable of such elaborate deception and financial betrayal. Even my neighbor Tom mentioned that he'd lost respect for Vanessa after learning that the expensive BMW rides she'd been taking were actually dates with a married man funded by money stolen from our shared savings account. By Thursday, Vanessa's voicemails revealed that Brian had also disappeared from her life, apparently cutting contact after his wife had somehow discovered their affair and confronted him about his weekend getaways and unexplained expenses. The photography business mentorship had evaporated along with Brian's availability, leaving Vanessa with expensive equipment she'd purchased on credit and absolutely no income source to pay for it or any of the other financial commitments she'd accumulated during her 3-month exploration of luxury lifestyle possibilities. Her final message that week was a broken whisper admitting that she'd made terrible mistakes and destroyed the best relationship she'd ever had for someone who'd turned out to be using her just as much as she'd been using me. She understood now why I'd left the way I did, she said, because confronting her directly would have just resulted in more lies and manipulation, and maybe she deserved to face the consequences of her choices without my financial support to cushion the impact of her decisions. The poetic justice was that she'd been so focused on figuring herself out through expensive hotel stays and romantic dinners that she'd never bothered to figure out how she'd survive without the stability and security I'd been providing all along. And now she was learning the hard way that authentic self-discovery doesn't come with room service and spa treatments charged to someone else's credit card. The collapse of Vanessa's carefully constructed fantasy life accelerated faster than I'd anticipated, creating a domino effect that would have been satisfying if it wasn't so completely predictable. She'd returned from her final romantic weekend with Brian to find not just an empty apartment, but a comprehensive documentation of every lie she'd told, every dollar she'd stolen, and every moment she'd spent building a relationship with someone else while I'd been planning our future together like some kind of naive fool. The financial breakdown I'd left on the kitchen table was particularly thorough, showing exactly how much of our engagement fund had been redirected to finance her luxury lifestyle exploration, complete with hotel receipts, restaurant charges, and credit card statements that painted an undeniable picture of systematic deception and theft. Her attempts to contact me had failed completely because I'd anticipated every possible avenue she might use to reach me and closed them all off with the kind of methodical planning that had served me well in my engineering career. Brian's disappearance from her life happened even faster than mine, apparently triggered by his wife Catherine discovering the affair through social media posts that were too obvious to ignore or explain away as business networking. According to the gossip network that Tyler was monitoring for me, Catherine Morrison had confronted her husband with printed screenshots of his romantic dinners with Vanessa, forcing him to choose between his marriage and his midlife crisis affair with an elementary school teacher who thought she was dating a successful single businessman. Brian had chosen his family and his reputation over his hotel room adventures, cutting all contact with Vanessa and leaving her with expensive photography equipment she'd purchased on credit for a business venture that had never been anything more than an elaborate cover story for their relationship. The photography mentorship had been as fake as everything else about their connection, another lie she'd told herself to justify what she knew was morally and financially wrong but had been too intoxicated by luxury and attention to resist. Vanessa's social media posts during this period told the story of someone desperately trying to control a narrative that was spiraling completely beyond her control, shifting from cryptic inspirational quotes about personal growth to increasingly obvious pleas for sympathy and financial support. Her Instagram stories became a masterclass in manipulation, featuring carefully staged photos of her crying in the empty apartment with captions about unexpected abandonment and the cruelty of people who claimed to love you but disappeared when you needed them most. She posted about toxic masculinity and emotional abuse, painting herself as the victim of my calculated exit rather than the architect of her own destruction through months of deliberate deception and financial betrayal. The comments section became a battlefield as our mutual friends who knew the truth began publicly challenging her version of events, sharing details about the hotel receipts and Brian's married status that made it impossible for her to maintain her victim narrative. Sarah from her teaching team left a particularly devastating comment pointing out that Vanessa had spent months lying to everyone about her whereabouts and activities, making it hypocritical to complain about dishonesty and abandonment when those were exactly the tactics she'd used against someone who genuinely loved and supported her. Jessica was even more direct, posting copies of the financial documents I'd shared showing how Vanessa had systematically stolen money from our joint accounts to fund her affair, making it clear that I hadn't abandoned her but had simply stopped enabling her destructive and selfish behavior. The financial reality of her situation became undeniable within 2 weeks when the first eviction notice appeared on her apartment door, a bright yellow warning that she had 30 days to bring her rent current or face legal action from the landlord. Her teacher's salary couldn't cover even half the monthly expenses for the luxury downtown Phoenix apartment she'd chosen because it impressed Brian and made her feel successful and sophisticated rather than practical and affordable. The credit card bills from her 3-month luxury lifestyle experiment were equally crushing, totaling over $12,000 in charges for hotels, restaurants, designer clothes, and photography equipment that she justified as business investments but were actually just the material accessories of an elaborate affair that had cost her everything real in pursuit of something that had never been genuine. Her attempts to find roommates or downsize to a cheaper place were complicated by her damaged credit score and the fact that she'd have to explain to potential landlords why she was facing eviction from her current apartment despite having a steady job teaching elementary school. The photography equipment she'd purchased for her fake business venture with Brian became a constant reminder of how completely she'd been deceived, expensive cameras and lighting gear that she had no idea how to use professionally and no market for selling secondhand because she'd bought everything on credit and still owed more than the depreciated equipment was worth. Her desperate attempts to salvage some income from the photography business failed immediately when she realized that Brian had been her only potential client and without his connections in real estate marketing, she had no network, no portfolio, and no practical skills to build an actual business around equipment she'd purchased as props for her affair rather than tools for legitimate work. The teaching position that had once provided her with stable income and health insurance benefits became tenuous as her emotional instability and financial stress began affecting her classroom performance in ways that concerned her principal and the parents of her students. She'd always been a competent teacher, but the chaos of her personal life was bleeding into her professional responsibilities, making it difficult for her to maintain the patience and focus that elementary education required even under normal circumstances. Her colleagues noticed the changes in her behavior and appearance, the way she'd become distracted during meetings and defensive when anyone asked about her well-being or offered support during what was obviously a difficult personal period that she was trying unsuccessfully to hide from her work environment. 3 months after my strategic exit from Vanessa's life, the ripple effects of her choices had spread far beyond what either of us had anticipated, creating a cautionary tale that had become legendary among our mutual friends and professional networks. Vanessa had lost the downtown Phoenix apartment as predicted, facing eviction proceedings that had damaged her credit score and made it nearly impossible to secure decent housing without substantial deposits and consignors she couldn't find. She'd been forced to move back in with her parents in their cramped 2-bedroom house in Glendale, sharing space with her mother's disapproval and her father's silent judgment about how she'd managed to destroy what they'd considered the most stable relationship of her adult life. Her parents had never particularly liked me, but they'd respected my financial stability and the fact that I'd treated their daughter well, making it impossible for Vanessa to blame her situation on my character flaws rather than her own deliberate choices. The credit card debt from her luxury lifestyle experiment with Brian had ballooned to over $18,000 with interest and late fees, an amount that would take years to pay off on her elementary school teacher's salary even if she could manage to keep her job despite the ongoing performance issues that were affecting her classroom management and professional relationships. Her attempts to declare bankruptcy were complicated by the fact that most of her debt had been incurred through what could be classified as fraudulent spending, using joint accounts and credit cards to fund personal expenses that had nothing to do with legitimate shared household costs or emergency situations. Meanwhile, I had rebuilt my life in Tucson with the kind of systematic approach that had served me well in engineering projects, creating new routines and relationships that were based on honesty and mutual respect rather than deception and financial manipulation. I'd accepted a senior consultant position with a firm that specialized in renewable energy infrastructure, earning a 25% salary increase while working on projects that felt meaningful and challenging in ways my previous job had never provided. My studio apartment near the university was small but comfortable, furnished with carefully chosen pieces that reflected my actual preferences rather than compromises made to accommodate someone else's expensive tastes and unrealistic lifestyle expectations. The dating scene in Tucson was refreshingly straightforward compared to the elaborate psychological games I'd unknowingly been playing with Vanessa for months, with women who were direct about their intentions and honest about their financial situations rather than maintaining elaborate cover stories about professional development and personal growth. I joined a hiking group that met every weekend, participated in volunteer work with Habitat for Humanity, and started taking photography classes at the community college, discovering interests and hobbies that I'd neglected while focusing all my energy on trying to build a future with someone who'd been secretly building a different future with someone else. The contrast between my new life and Vanessa's deteriorating situation became even more apparent when additional evidence of her deception surfaced through mutual friends who had started comparing notes about inconsistencies in her stories and timelines over the past several months. Catherine Morrison, Brian's wife, had reached out to several people in our social network after discovering that Vanessa wasn't the only woman her husband had been mentoring through expensive hotel stays and professional development opportunities. Catherine shared screenshots of romantic text messages between Brian and Vanessa that revealed the true nature of their photography business partnership, including explicit discussions about their hotel room encounters and plans to continue their affair even after Brian's wife became suspicious about his weekend disappearances and unexplained expenses. These revelations destroyed any remaining sympathy Vanessa might have received from friends who had initially been willing to believe her version of events about my sudden abandonment and cruel departure from our relationship without warning or discussion. The evidence made it clear that she'd been living a double life for months while accepting my financial support and planning what she'd thought would be our engagement, making her complaints about trust and communication particularly hypocritical and offensive to people who had genuinely cared about both of us. Vanessa's teaching position became increasingly precarious as her financial stress and emotional instability continued to affect her professional performance in ways that couldn't be ignored or accommodated indefinitely by her principal and the school district administration. Parents had begun complaining about her distracted behavior during conferences and her apparent inability to maintain consistent classroom discipline, while her colleagues noted that she'd become unreliable about fulfilling duties like supervision and committee work that were essential parts of her employment contract. The school district's employee assistance program had offered counseling and support services, but Vanessa's pride and her continued insistence that she was the victim of other people's cruelty rather than the architect of her own destruction made it difficult for her to accept help or acknowledge the need for significant changes in her attitude and behavior patterns. My complete disappearance from Phoenix had become something of a legend among our friend group, inspiring discussions about the most effective ways to respond to betrayal and manipulation in romantic relationships without getting drawn into drama or extended conflict that ultimately benefited no one involved. Several people had adopted similar strategies when dealing with their own relationship problems, implementing clean breaks and strategic withdrawals rather than engaging in lengthy negotiations or attempts to salvage connections that had been fundamentally damaged by deception and financial abuse. Tyler had become something of an expert on helping people execute similar exits, assisting 3 other friends with apartment searches and logistics for leaving toxic relationships quickly and decisively rather than allowing themselves to be manipulated into staying through guilt, promises of change, or threats of self-harm that were designed to maintain unhealthy power dynamics. The consensus among our mutual friends was that my response had been both appropriate and necessary, setting boundaries that protected my financial security and emotional well-being while allowing Vanessa to face the natural consequences of her choices without interference or enabling that would have delayed her reckoning with reality. Even people who had initially criticized my departure as harsh or unforgiving had changed their opinions after learning the full scope of Vanessa's deception and the systematic way she'd stolen money from our joint accounts to fund her affair with a married man she'd convinced herself was going to provide her with a more luxurious lifestyle than I could offer on my engineering consultant salary. A year after discovering those hotel receipts in Vanessa's purse, I had built a life in Tucson that exceeded every expectation I'd had for my post-relationship recovery, proving that sometimes the best thing someone can do for you is reveal their true character early enough for you to make informed decisions about your future. My promotion to senior engineering consultant had led to additional opportunities in renewable energy consulting, including a partnership stake in a startup focused on solar infrastructure development that could potentially set me up for early retirement if our projects continued gaining momentum with investors and municipal clients. The financial independence I'd achieved by removing Vanessa's drain on my resources had allowed me to pursue investment opportunities and career risks that would have been impossible while supporting someone else's luxury lifestyle and poor financial decisions. My studio apartment had evolved into a comfortable 1-bedroom place with a home office where I could work remotely on consulting projects, decorated with photography from my weekend hiking adventures and furnished with pieces that reflected my actual preferences rather than compromises made to accommodate someone else's expensive tastes. The hiking group I joined had become a core part of my social life, introducing me to people who shared interests in outdoor activities and environmental conservation rather than designer handbags and expensive restaurants, creating friendships based on common values and genuine compatibility rather than financial dependency and manipulation. My photography skills had improved dramatically through community college classes and weekend practice sessions in the desert landscapes around Tucson, giving me a creative outlet that was entirely my own rather than something I'd been pressured into funding for someone else's fake business venture. Dating in my new city had been refreshingly straightforward, with women who were direct about their intentions and honest about their financial situations, leading to several meaningful connections that were based on mutual respect and shared goals rather than elaborate deception and strategic manipulation designed to extract resources and emotional labor. Meanwhile, Vanessa's situation had continued deteriorating in ways that were both predictable and entirely preventable if she'd made different choices about honesty, loyalty, and financial responsibility during our relationship. According to updates I received through Tyler and our mutual friend network, She'd eventually been placed on administrative leave from her teaching position after her performance issues escalated to the point where parents were requesting their children be transferred to different classrooms, and her principal could no longer ignore the impact of her personal problems on her professional responsibilities. The photography equipment she'd purchased for her fake business with Brian had been repossessed when she defaulted on the credit payments, adding another negative mark to her credit report that would affect her ability to secure decent housing or employment for years to come. Her attempts to rebuild her career had been complicated by references from her former principal that were professionally diplomatic but personally devastating, describing her as someone who had shown potential but had allowed personal issues to interfere with her commitment to student education and professional development. Vanessa had eventually started therapy to address what she described as her pattern of making poor relationship decisions and her inability to maintain financial stability, though according to mutual friends who occasionally encountered her at social events, she continued to frame her situation as the result of other people's betrayal rather than her own systematic deception and manipulation. Her social media presence had evolved from desperate pleas for sympathy to inspirational quotes about healing from toxic relationships and learning to love yourself, but the comment sections revealed that most people who knew her history weren't buying her reinvention as a victim of circumstances beyond her control. She'd moved from her parents' house to a small apartment with 2 roommates, working part-time retail jobs to supplement her unemployment benefits while supposedly searching for another teaching position that would give her a fresh start in a district where her reputation hadn't been damaged by her previous performance issues. The contrast between our respective recoveries from the end of our relationship had become a case study among our friends about the importance of taking responsibility for your choices and learning from mistakes rather than blaming external factors for problems you created through your own decisions and behavior patterns. Several people had mentioned that my strategic exit and subsequent success had inspired them to reevaluate their own relationships and set firmer boundaries around financial transparency and emotional honesty, implementing joint account monitoring systems and regular check-ins about spending and priorities to prevent similar betrayals from developing undetected over months or years. The hotel receipts that had started my entire discovery process had become symbolic of how small signs can reveal massive deceptions if you're willing to pay attention and investigate inconsistencies rather than making excuses for behavior that doesn't align with someone's stated values and commitments. Tyler had developed this into a broader philosophy about relationship red flags and the importance of trusting your instincts when something feels wrong rather than allowing yourself to be gaslighted into questioning your own observations and reasonable concerns about your partner's activities and financial behavior. My new approach to relationships centered on transparency and independence, having learned that the healthiest connections are built between people who choose to be together rather than people who need each other for financial security or emotional validation, and who maintain their individual identities and interests rather than losing themselves in codependent dynamics that enable destructive behavior patterns. The experience had taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is remove your support system and let them face the consequences of their choices alone, allowing them to discover whether they're capable of growth and change without external enablers cushioning the impact of their poor decisions. The irony wasn't lost on me that Vanessa had spent months in luxury hotel rooms supposedly figuring herself out, but had only achieved genuine self-discovery after losing the financial safety net that had been preventing her from confronting the reality of her situation and the unsustainability of her lifestyle choices and relationship patterns. My life philosophy had evolved to prioritize authenticity and mutual respect over grand romantic gestures and expensive demonstrations of love, recognizing that genuine partnership requires both people to contribute meaningfully to the relationship rather than one person carrying the financial and emotional burden while the other person takes credit for the lifestyle that results from their partner's sacrifice and hard work.